It happened at Sunday brunch. The clinking of silverware against porcelain was the only music in the room. A familiar, cheerful sound that always felt a little fake to me. We were at the Gilded Spoon, my father's favorite place. It was all polished wood, starched white tablecloths, and waiters who moved like ghosts. It was the kind of place that made me feel like I needed to wipe my feet on the way in. Even though my shoes were the cleanest thing I owned, I was sitting between my mother, who was meticulously dabbing the corners of her mouth with a napkin, and my younger sister, Maya, whose world was contained in the bright, silent screen of her phone. Across from me, my father, Michael Carter, was holding court, telling some story about a golf game that involved a surprising amount of drama. He was good at that, making the ordinary sound important. He was the sun, and we were all expected to be his planets, orbiting in perfect, predictable paths. Before we dive in, if this story touches you at any point, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it so I can keep growing and tell more stories like this. My grandfather, Henry, sat at the head of the table. He was the real son, though he didn't demand the attention. At 82, his eyes were still bright, and his smile was the only one in the family that ever felt completely real. He had driven 3 hours to be here for his monthly family visit, and his presence was like a warm blanket in a cold room. I was swirling the last of my orange juice, trying to look engaged in my father's story when Grandpa Henry raised his glass. The light caught the crystal, sending a small rainbow dancing across the tablecloth. "A toast," he said, his voice warm and clear. Everyone quieted down. My father paused his story, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes at being interrupted, but he smoothed it over with a practiced smile. Grandpa's eyes found mine across the table. They were full of a genuine, uncomplicated pride that I so rarely saw directed my way. "To Lily," he announced. "I was just thinking on the drive over how proud I am of her. Standing on her own 2 feet, making her way in the world." He beamed, and I felt a familiar, uncomfortable warmth spread across my cheeks. I was never good with praise. It always felt like a test I was about to fail. Then he added the words that would bring the whole charade crashing down. "And I'm so glad you love the apartment I got you, sweetheart." My hand, which was halfway to my mouth with a glass of water, froze. The motion stopped so abruptly that a few drops of water sloshed over the rim, landing cold on my knuckles. The sound of my father's voice had vanished. The clinking of silverware from other tables seemed to fade into a dull, distant hum. The entire room, the entire world, went perfectly, terribly still. I watched as if in slow motion as my mother's hand paused on its way to her coffee cup. The pale pink lipstick she wore seemed to tremble on her lips. Beside me, Maya's thumb stopped its endless hypnotic scrolling. Even she, in her bubble of digital indifference, had felt the shift in the air. Then came the loudest sound in the sudden silence. My father's fork, heavy and silver, slipped from his fingers and clattered onto his plate. It was a sharp metallic sound, a gunshot in a library. I lowered my glass to the table, my hand shaking so slightly I was sure no one else could see. My throat felt tight as if a string had been pulled around it. I looked at my grandfather, whose smile was still in place, completely unaware of the bomb he had just detonated. "What apartment?" I whispered. The words were so quiet. I wasn't sure I'd said them aloud. But everyone heard. Grandpa blinked, his smile faltering into a look of gentle confusion. He tilted his head as if he hadn't heard me correctly. "The apartment. Honey. The one I paid for the condo downtown after you graduated. Your graduation present." My stomach didn't just drop. It felt like it had been scooped out of me with a cold, sharp spoon, leaving a hollow, echoing void. The condo downtown. My graduation present. The words didn't make sense. They were from a different language, a different life. A life where a grandfather buys his granddaughter a home and she actually receives it. My life for the last 4 years was a world away from a downtown condo. My life was a basement, a damp, windowless room in the back of a house owned by a woman named Mrs. Hargrove, who smoked so heavily the smell seeped through the floorboards and clung to my clothes. My life was paying my $600 rent every month in cash because she didn't trust banks. My life was the constant groaning rumble of the boiler, which was my closest and most reliable roommate. My life was secondhand furniture, a mattress I found on the curb, and the perpetual feeling of being underground, both literally and figuratively. And in one terrible, clarifying moment, the two realities collided: the life my grandfather had intended for me, and the life I was actually living. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying certainty. The money. The apartment he had bought for me. The lectures from my father about responsibility, about how he and my mother couldn't afford to help me, about how I needed to learn the value of $1 by earning every single one of them myself. The way he would look at me with a kind of disappointed pride whenever I told him I'd picked up an extra shift. "That's my girl," he'd say. "Making her own way?" The truth landed not like a thunderclap, but like a silent, suffocating wave. It washed over the table, over our fake family brunch, and drowned everything. My eyes slowly moved from my grandfather's confused face to my father's. His skin was pale, waxy. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at his plate, at the fork he had dropped, as if it held the answers to the universe. He had taken it. He had taken the money meant for my future, for my home, for my start in life. He had taken it. And he had let me struggle. He had watched me work myself to bone-tired exhaustion day after day, year after year, knowing he was holding the key to my relief in his pocket. And no one said a word. The lie had been his, but the silence had belonged to everyone. Everyone at this table had known something, or suspected something, or at the very least had chosen not to see. Until now, the question had been asked. The room was broken, and the silence was finally, irrevocably, over. My name is Lily Carter. I'm 27 years old, but on most days, I feel closer to 40. The kind of tired I carry in my bones isn't from a lack of sleep. It's the deep, weary ache of having to fight for things that are supposed to be given, like support. Or at the very least, honesty. After I graduated from college with a degree in interior design, I was just like every other kid, hopeful, a little scared, and broke. I had a portfolio full of drawings and dreams, but my bank account was empty. I moved back home for a month into my childhood bedroom, but the tension was thick enough to choke on. My father made it clear that my presence was a temporary arrangement. The real world is waiting. Lily, he'd say over dinner. Not unkindly, but with a firm, unyielding pressure. You need to learn responsibility. Your mother and I aren't a safety net. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? He was my dad. His words were the foundation I'd built my understanding of the world on. So, I packed my 2 suitcases and found the cheapest place I could, which happened to be the basement room in Mrs. Khan's, Hargrove's house. The first few months were the hardest. I sent out dozens of applications to design firms and got nothing back but polite rejections. The industry was competitive and I didn't have the connections or the polished confidence of the other applicants. My portfolio felt thin, my dreams flimsy. So, I did what I had to do. I got a job cleaning offices from 5 inches the morning until noon. It was quiet. Anonymous work. I'd scrub toilets and empty trash cans in gleaming corporate buildings where people with lives I couldn't imagine would arrive just as I was leaving. Smelling of bleach and exhaustion. I'd see pictures of their families on their desks and feel a pang of something I couldn't name. In the afternoons, I'd go home to my basement, shower, and try to sleep for a couple of hours before my second job. I was a waitress at a family restaurant called The Corner Bistro. I'd spend my night serving tables, smiling at customers, and battling the ache in my feet. I'd get home around midnight, my clothes smelling like grease and my pockets holding a handful of cash tips that would barely cover my groceries for the week. I told myself it was temporary, a character-building phase. I was paying my dues. That's what my dad called it. I remember one night about a year in. I called him. I was sitting on the edge of my lumpy mattress listening to the boiler kick on with a loud groan. I was so tired I could feel it behind my eyes. I had just gotten a bill for my student loans, and looking at the number made me feel sick. "Dad," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I was just wondering, do you know anyone who's hiring, even for an internship? I'd do anything. I just feel like I'm falling behind." There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the television in the background, the sounds of his comfortable life. "Lily, we've talked about this," he said, his voice laced with that familiar, patient disappointment. "No one is going to hand you anything. You have to earn it. If you're not making enough money, get a third job. Flip burgers if you have to. It builds character." I mumbled a quiet, "Okay," and hung up. I didn't cry. I had learned by then that crying didn't pay the rent. I just sat there in the dark, feeling the immense distance between his world and mine. He wasn't just refusing to help. He was making my struggle a necessary part of my education. A lesson I had to learn. My mother was a ghost in these conversations. Whenever I brought up my struggles, she would get a pained look on her face and find something urgent to do in another room. My dad co-signed a lease for her beautiful apartment in a trendy part of the city and bought her a new car as a graduation present. When I once tried to explain to her how hard it was for me, how I was barely scraping by, she just rolled her eyes. "Oh my God. Lily, you're always so dramatic," she'd said, texting as she talked. "It's not that hard. Just like, budget better or something?" So, I learned to survive on my own. I became an expert in thrift store furniture and instant noodles. I learned that loneliness was a physical presence, a cold spot in the bed next to me. I stopped talking about my jobs, my basement, my exhaustion. I learned to build a wall around my life, to present a version of myself at family gatherings that was fine. Just fine. Because anything else was considered a complaint, a weakness, a drama. I learned to live in the silence they had created for me. For 4 years, this was my normal. This was the reality I had accepted. I had accepted that I was the forgotten one, the one who had to struggle, the one who wasn't worthy of the help my sister received so effortlessly. I had internalized their narrative. Maya was the success, and I was the lesson. So when my grandfather said those words, "The apartment I got you," it didn't just break the silence at the brunch table. It shattered the very foundation of my reality. Every lecture about responsibility, every dismissive comment from my sister, every time my mother looked away, it all flashed through my mind. But this time, it was different. It was all tainted, twisted into something monstrous. My struggle hadn't been a necessary lesson. It had been a lie. A deliberate, cruel, and calculated lie orchestrated by my own father. He hadn't been teaching me character. He had been funding his own life with a gift that was meant to start mine. And the family I had tried so hard to please had been complicit in their silence. The ground beneath my feet was gone, and I was falling. The silence that followed my whispered question, "What apartment?" was heavy and thick like wet wool. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. We were a portrait of a broken family, frozen in the moment of impact. My grandfather was the first to speak, his voice losing its cheerful warmth and taking on a note of deep confusion. He looked from my pale face to my father's rigid back. "The condo. Michael," Grandpa said, his words directed squarely at my dad. "The one on Elm Street. I bought it for Lily. You handled the paperwork? You told me she moved in right after graduation and loved it." Every head at the table swiveled to face my father. He still hadn't looked up from his plate. He seemed to be studying the pattern of the china as if it were the most fascinating thing in the world. My mother's hand, which had been frozen near her coffee cup, began to tremble. A delicate, almost imperceptible tremor. She placed it in her lap out of sight. "Michael," she said, her voice thin and reedy, a sound I hadn't heard since I was a child. "What is he talking about?" My father finally lifted his head. His face was a mess of emotions: shock, fear, and a flash of anger, as if we were the ones who had done something wrong by uncovering his secret. He cleared his throat, trying to gather the authority he always wore, like a well-tailored suit. "It was an investment, Henry," he said, his voice attempting a casual tone that failed miserably. "The market wasn't right. I was holding on to it for her. I meant to handle it later." The lie was so flimsy, so insulting in its simplicity that something inside me snapped. The years of quiet acceptance, of biting my tongue, of swallowing my hurt, it all dissolved in a rush of pure, cold anger. "No," I said. My voice was sharp, cutting through the tense air. It sounded louder than I expected. Stronger. "You didn't mean to handle it later. You meant to keep it." Every head which had been focused on my father now turned to me. I could feel their surprise. I was Lily, the quiet one, the one who didn't make waves. But the woman who said those words wasn't her. She was someone new. Someone who had just been born in the fire of this betrayal. My grandfather's eyes hardened. The gentle confusion was gone, replaced by a dawning, terrible understanding. He stared at my father, his son, and I could see the exact moment his trust in him shattered. "I wired that money directly to you, Michael," Grandpa said, his voice low and dangerous. $70,000. The wire transfer stated its purpose explicitly. "For Lily's condo, $70,000. The number hung in the air, obscene and impossible. I did the math in my head, my mind racing. That was more money than I had made in the last 4 years combined. Enough for a home. Enough for a life without constant crushing anxiety. Enough for a future." My own voice was a whisper again. But this time, it wasn't from shock. It was from the sheer crushing weight of the cruelty. "He told me to work harder," I said, my voice shaking with a grief so profound it felt like it was tearing me apart. "He told me to get a third job. He told me I was on my own. All that time he was sitting on my future. He pocketed my future." For the first time in my entire life, my father looked small. The confidence, the authority, the self-righteousness, it was all gone. He was just a man stripped bare by his own greed and deceit. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. What could he say? The truth was there, laid bare on the white tablecloth between us. More shocking than any accusation. I couldn't sit there anymore. I couldn't be in that room breathing that poisoned air. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the polished floor. The sound was jarring, violent. It felt right. I stood up, my legs feeling surprisingly steady. I looked down at my father, at this stranger who had raised me. "You always told me that truth builds character," I said, my voice even and clear. "Guess I finally have some." I turned and walked away. I didn't run. I didn't look back. I could feel their stares on my back. A physical weight. I walked past the other tables of happy families having their cheerful Sunday brunches, and I didn't feel a thing. I was numb. Hollowed out. But for the first time in a very long time, I felt free. I walked out of the restaurant, out of the lie, and into the cold, clean air of the truth. The air outside was cold and sharp against my hot cheeks. It was a typical gray October day, the kind that threatens rain but never delivers. I stood on the pavement of the parking lot, wrapping my arms around myself, though the chill I felt had nothing to do with the weather. It was a cold that came from the inside, a deep cellular shock. I could still see them through the large plate glass window of the restaurant, a frozen tableau at the table, their faces a mixture of horror and confusion. I just needed to breathe, to take in air that wasn't thick with deceit. I leaned against a parked car, the cold metal a small grounding reality. Where was I supposed to go? What was I supposed to do now? My entire past felt like a lie. And my future was a blank, terrifying map. The basement that had been my sanctuary, my private world of struggle, now felt like a prison cell built by my own father. Then I heard it. The sound of the restaurant door opening, followed by hurried footsteps on the pavement. I tensed, my body bracing for a confrontation I didn't have the energy for. I assumed it was my father coming to spin another lie or my mother coming to plead for peace, for me to just let it go. "Lily, wait." The voice was tired, strained, but it was my grandfather's. I turned as he caught up to me, his hand resting on my arm. He was out of breath, and his face, which was usually so full of life, looked pale and sunken. His eyes were wet. "You really," he started, then stopped to catch his breath. "You really never got that apartment?" The question was so simple, so full of a pain that mirrored my own. All I could do was shake my head. Words felt too big, too difficult. "I live in a basement," I finally managed to say, the words tasting like ash. "My roommate is a boiler." The expression on his face was something I will never forget. It was like someone had punched the air out of him. The last bit of color drained from his skin. He looked past me toward the anonymous city skyline as if he could see the last 4 years of my life playing out in the gray clouds. "Your father?" he said, his voice raspy with disbelief. "He told me you refused my help. He said you were fiercely independent and that you wanted to make it on your own. He made it sound so noble." A bitter, humorless laugh escaped my lips. "Independent? Grandpa?" I was desperate. I asked him for a job lead once. Just a lead. I told him I'd sweep floors at one of his friends' companies if it meant getting a foot in the door. What did he say? Grandpa asked, his eyes locking onto mine, demanding the truth. He told me to go flip burgers at McDonald's. I said flatly. He said it would be good for me. Teach me humility. My grandfather's face, which had been filled with sorrow, began to darken with a slow, burning anger. It was an anger I had never seen in him before. It was frightening and, in a strange way, comforting. It was an anger on my behalf. He told me you were ungrateful, Grandpa whispered, as if confessing a sin. He said he and your mother offered you everything, but you threw it back in their faces. He said you were difficult, that you never appreciated what you had. The words were like slaps, ungrateful, difficult. For years, I had secretly wondered if they were true. I had spent countless nights in my basement room wondering what was wrong with me, why I couldn't be more like Maya, why I felt so disconnected from my own family. I had blamed myself, thinking I was the problem. Now I knew it was all part of the story he had constructed to hide his crime. He hadn't just stolen my money. He had stolen my character, rewriting me as the villain in a story where he was the patient, long-suffering father. I looked my grandfather straight in the eye, the numbness inside me finally giving way to a clean, sharp rage. I didn't know I was supposed to thank him for theft, I said. My grandfather's jaw tightened. He pulled his hand away from my arm and clenched it into a fist at his side. He looked back at the restaurant, at the son he had raised, the son who had lied to him, stolen from him, and used his generosity as a weapon against his own child. This is not just about the money, Lily, he said, his voice low and steady. He lied to me. He used my love for you to hurt you. That I cannot forgive. In that moment, standing in that cold, impersonal parking lot, I felt a bond with my grandfather that I had never felt before. We were two people on an island, the last survivors of a shipwreck we hadn't seen coming. We were the ones who had been betrayed. We were a team. The anger was still there, a hot coil in my stomach. But for the first time, I didn't feel alone in it. I had an ally, and he was just as furious as I was. My grandfather stood in silence for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the restaurant window where the remnants of our family were still sitting, trapped in the wreckage. The anger on his face was slowly being replaced by a look of grim determination. I want to fix this, he said quietly, turning back to me. His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. I crossed my arms over my chest, a defensive posture I'd adopted long ago. How? I asked. The word came out more broken than I intended. How could he fix 4 years of lies? How could he give me back the time I'd lost? The opportunities I'd missed? The belief in my own family that had been stolen from me? He didn't offer empty platitudes or easy promises. Instead, he looked at me, his eyes searching mine, and said 4 simple words. "Show me your place." The request caught me off guard. A wave of shame washed over me. My basement wasn't a place you showed people. It was a secret, a symbol of my failure, of the life I was living versus the one I was supposed to have. But looking at my grandfather's face, I saw no judgment, only a deep, resonant need to understand the full scope of the lie. "Okay," I whispered. That night, after a tense and largely silent car ride back from the city, I drove him there. My old beat-up car rattled down the streets leading to my neighborhood, a part of town that was all cracked sidewalks and houses that looked as tired as I felt. When I pulled up to Mrs. Hargrove's house, it was already dark. The porch light was out as usual. "This is it," I said, trying to sound casual. He got out of the car and looked at the house, then at the narrow, crumbling concrete steps that led down the side of the building to a separate entrance below ground level. He didn't say a word, just followed me. I unlocked the door and flipped the switch. A single bare bulb flickered on, casting a weak yellow light over the room. "Welcome to my palace," I said, the bitter irony hanging heavy in the air. He stepped inside, and his size seemed to shrink the already tiny space. He stood in the middle of the room on the worn linoleum floor and slowly took it all in. The silence was absolute, broken only by the hum of the ancient refrigerator in the corner and the faint rhythmic drip of a leaky pipe somewhere in the walls. I saw the room through his eyes. I saw the sagging ceiling stained with water spots from the bathroom above. I saw the walls a sickly yellow from years of Mrs. Hargrove's smoke seeping through the floorboards. I saw my lumpy mattress on a simple metal frame pushed against one wall right next to the hulking, groaning laundry machine. There was no real kitchen, just a hot plate and a microwave on a rickety card table. There were no windows. He walked over to the wall that separated my room from the boiler room and placed a hand on it. He could probably feel the faint vibration, the low rumble of the machine that was the soundtrack to my life. He looked at the small wobbly desk where I used to spread out my design portfolio, trying to dream in a place that felt utterly devoid of hope. He had imagined me in a bright, sunny condo with a view. He had pictured me safe, secure, and starting my life. And all the while, I was here in the dark, underground. He turned to me, his face a mask of grief and fury. He looked like a man who had just witnessed a terrible crime. In a way, he had. Then he whispered, the words barely audible over the hum of the boiler. "He didn't just steal from you, Lily. He stole from both of us." I could only nod, a knot of unshed tears forming in my throat. In his words, I found a validation that was more powerful than any apology. He wasn't just my grandfather. He was my fellow victim. He had been robbed of the joy of providing for his granddaughter, robbed of the truth, robbed of his trust in his own son. He stood there for another minute, his jaw set like stone. The gentle, smiling man from the brunch table was gone. In his place was someone I had never seen before. A man ready for war. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice no longer a whisper, but a low, steely command. "We're going to the bank." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a promise. A promise that the hiding was over. The lies were over. The silence was over. Tomorrow we were going to find the truth in black and white. And we were going to use it to take back everything my father had stolen. If this story is hitting something deep inside you, if any part of it feels familiar, please subscribe to the channel and share this video so I can keep growing and bring more stories like this to people who need to hear them. I barely slept that night. My grandfather had insisted I stay with him in the guest room of his quiet, comfortable house, a place I hadn't visited in over a year. The sheets were clean and smelled of lavender, a stark contrast to the perpetual scent of damp and smoke that clung to everything I owned. But comfort felt foreign, and sleep was a country I couldn't find my way back to. I lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene at the restaurant over and over. My father's pale face, my mother's trembling hand, the clatter of the fork. It was a movie stuck on a loop, each viewing more painful than the last. The next morning, I was awake before the sun. I came downstairs to find my grandfather already in the kitchen, a cup of black coffee in his hand, staring out the window at the dawn. He wasn't dressed in his usual relaxed retirement clothes. He was wearing a suit, the kind he used to wear when he ran his construction company. It was his armor. He heard me enter and turned, his eyes clear and resolved. The grief from the day before had been burned away, leaving something harder in its place. "Good morning, Lily," he said, his voice all business. "There's coffee on the counter." Before I could even take a sip, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number from memory. There were no pleasantries. "Lawson. It's Henry Carter," he said, his voice crisp and authoritative. "I need you at the main branch in an hour. And I need you to find a transaction record for me, a wire transfer from my personal account to my son, Michael Carter, from approximately 4 years ago. The amount was $70,000. Find the transfer, every cent, and find out where it went." He listened for a moment, then said, "I don't care what you have to move around. We will be there at 9 a.m. Thank you, Lawson." He hung up and looked at me. "Get dressed," he said. "Wear something that makes you feel strong." By 9, we were sitting in a large, intimidating office in the downtown branch of his bank. It was an old building with marble floors that echoed our footsteps and dark wood paneling that seemed to absorb all sound. It felt like a temple dedicated to facts, a place where numbers didn't lie. The banker? A man named Lawson, with kind eyes and a serious suit, greeted my grandfather with a respectful handshake. He led us to a conference room where a computer monitor sat on a long, polished table. "I found it," Henry, Lawson said quietly. Sitting down behind the keyboard, it wasn't difficult. He typed for a moment and the screen flickered to life. And there it was. A line of black and white text. Stark and undeniable. Date, June 12th, 2021. Transfer from Henry J. Carter. Transfer to Michael R. Carter. Amount, $70,000. Memo, for Lily's condo purchase. I stared at the screen. My breath caught in my chest. Seeing it there in official, impersonal text made it real in a way it hadn't been before. It wasn't just a story anymore. It was a fact. A crime with a paper trail. My grandfather had done exactly what he'd said. He had tried to give me a home. Lawson's fingers tapped the keyboard again. That's the incoming transfer to your son's account, he explained, his voice neutral. And this is what happened next. Another screen appeared. A statement from my father's account. My eyes scanned the lines of debits and credits, my heart pounding in my ears. And then I saw it. Date, June 17th, 2021. Transfer to Vanguard Private Investment Account 748. Amount, $70,000. Juror O. War Memo. Initial investment. 5 days. It had taken him only 5 days. 5 days from receiving a gift meant for his daughter to rerouting it into a private investment account under his name. There was no mention of me. No indication that it was being held for my future. It was just gone. Absorbed into his own finances as if it had always belonged to him. The speed of it was what struck me the most. There was no hesitation. No crisis of conscience. Just a clean, efficient theft. I felt a wave of nausea. All those times I'd been short on rent. All those nights I had eaten instant noodles for dinner. All those shifts I had picked up when my body was screaming for rest. All of it had been happening while my money, my future, was sitting in an account growing for him. My grandfather didn't say a word. He just stared at the screen. His jaw so tight I could see the muscles working in his cheek. He had the look of a builder who had just discovered a fatal flaw in the foundation of a building he had constructed with his own hands. His son? His foundation, it was all rotten. When the banker turned to look at us, my grandfather's voice was as cold and hard as the marble floor outside. Print every page. Lawson. I want a certified copy of every single transaction. Lawson nodded quietly, tapping a few more keys before the printer in the corner whirred to life. He excused himself from the room, leaving us alone with the silent, damning evidence on the screen. My grandfather finally turned to me, his eyes filled with a pain that went beyond anger. He didn't just steal your money, Lily, he said, his voice soft now and full of a terrible sadness. He stole my trust, the trust a father is supposed to have in his son. I looked from his heartbroken face to the screen where the story of the last 4 years was told in 2 simple lines of text. The hollow feeling in my stomach was beginning to be replaced by something else. A cold, hard resolve. I was done being sad. I was done feeling like a victim. It was time to fight back. I met his eyes. Then let's take it back. The printer finished its work and a neat stack of papers slid into the tray. It was our ammunition. The truth in black and white. The drive to my parents' house was the longest 20 minutes of my life. I sat in the passenger seat of my grandfather's big, quiet car, the stack of certified bank statements resting on my lap. The papers felt heavy, dense with the weight of the truth they contained. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to say. We were a 2-person army on our way to the front lines. And the battlefield was the beige suburban house I had grown up in. When we pulled into the driveway, I saw Maya's new shiny SUV parked near the garage. A fresh wave of anger washed over me. The car my parents had helped her buy. The easy life they had provided for her, likely funded in part by the money that should have been mine. My grandfather put the car in park and turned to me. "Are you ready for this?" he asked. I nodded, clutching the papers. "I'm ready." We walked up the familiar stone path to the front door. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs. A frantic bird trapped in a cage. Before we could even ring the bell, the door opened. It was my mother on her way out to water the potted ferns on the porch. She froze when she saw us. The cheerful, automatic smile on her face dissolving into a look of startled panic. "Henry? Lily," she stammered, her eyes darting between my grandfather's grim expression and the file in my hands. We weren't expecting you." Just then, my father appeared in the doorway behind her. He was dressed in golf clothes, looking annoyed at the interruption. "What is all this?" he asked, his voice laced with impatience. "We need to talk, Michael," my grandfather said, his voice calm and even, but with an underlying tone of steel that stopped my father cold. My dad tried to wave it away, to reclaim his authority. "Now's not a good time, Dad. I was just heading out to meet some friends." He tried to smile. A weak, dismissive gesture. "Whatever this is, it can wait." My grandfather took a step forward, his presence seeming to fill the entire doorway. He looked his son in the eye, and the force of his gaze was immense. He said 2 words, and in those 2 words, the power dynamic of our entire family shifted forever. "Sit down." It was not a request. It was an order. And for the first time in my life, I saw my father obey without question. The bravado, the arrogance, it all fell away. He looked like a chastened child. He backed away from the door, and we followed him inside. The house was exactly as I remembered, clean. orderly, and silent. A museum of a happy family life. We walked past the living room and into the formal dining room, the one reserved for holidays and special occasions. The long, polished mahogany table reflected our tense faces like a dark mirror. "Sit," my grandfather said again, gesturing to the chairs. My father sat. My mother hovered nervously by the door, wringing her hands before finally sinking into a chair at the far end of the table. My grandfather and I took seats directly across from my dad. Without a word, my grandfather took the stack of papers from me and laid them on the table right in front of my father. He didn't slide them. He placed them down with deliberate, final precision. The sound of the paper hitting the polished wood was the only noise in the room. "These are bank records, Michael," my grandfather began, his voice dangerously quiet. "Certified. They tell a very interesting story. They show a transfer of $70,000 from my account to yours for the express purpose of buying your daughter a home." My father stared at the papers, refusing to touch them. His face was ashen. "And they show another transfer," my grandfather continued, his voice hardening. "5 days later, of that exact amount, into your personal investment account. You took the money meant for your daughter. You lied to her. You lied to me." My dad stammered, his eyes flickering from the papers to my grandfather's face, searching for an escape that wasn't there. I was saving it for her future. It was an investment. For her." The excuse was so pathetic, so transparently false that my grandfather didn't even let him finish. He snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. "She's been living in a basement." The words echoed in the silent room. My mother let out a small strangled sob and covered her mouth with her hand. My father flinched as if he'd been struck. And that's when I knew it was my turn. The fear I'd felt at the door was gone, replaced by a strange, cold calm. I had been silent for too long. I leaned forward, my hands flat on the table. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I spoke directly to him, my voice steady and clear. "You told me I wasn't working hard enough," I said. "You told me I didn't deserve help. You told me to flip burgers. You watched me work 2 jobs for 4 years. And you told me you were proud of my character. Was this part of the lesson? Dad was watching me suffer while you gambled with my future supposed to make me a better person." The truth, spoken plainly and without hysteria, hit him harder than any slap could. He sagged in his chair, the last of his defenses crumbling into dust. He had no words, no excuses, no lies left to tell. There was only the ugly, undeniable truth sitting on the table between us, reflected in the dark, polished wood. The silence that followed my question was absolute. My father stared at the polished surface of the dining room table. His reflection, a distorted, broken version of the man he pretended to be. My mother's quiet sobs were the only sound, each one a small punctuation mark in the story of our family's collapse. My grandfather let the silence hang in the air, letting the weight of the truth press down on my father. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out another document. It was a single sheet of thick, cream-colored paper folded in thirds. He opened it and slid it across the table. It stopped directly in front of my father. It was a formal letter printed on a lawyer's letterhead. "That is your future, Michael," my grandfather said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Read it." My father's hand trembled as he reached for the letter. His eyes scanned the page, his face growing paler with every word. I couldn't see what it said, but I could see the effect it was having on him. It was the look of a man seeing the bars of his cage closing around him. "You have two choices," my grandfather explained, his voice cold and methodical. "Choice one is that I take this file," he tapped the stack of bank statements, "to the district attorney, and I press charges for fraud and theft. You will be arrested. You will lose your job, your reputation, and very likely your freedom. I will testify against you. Lily will testify against you." He paused, letting the severity of that sink in. "Or," he continued, "you can accept the terms laid out in that letter. There will be no more lies. There will be no more negotiation. This is the only path forward that does not end in your complete ruin." My father's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He was trapped and he knew it. "What does it say?" my mother whispered, her voice raw from crying. My grandfather looked at her, his expression softening for a moment into one of deep disappointment. "It says that Michael will pay back every dollar, the full $70,000 plus 4 years of compound interest, to be calculated by my accountant. He will liquidate whatever assets are necessary. The money will be transferred into a trust for Lily within 6 months." He wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he said, his gaze returning to my father, "he will sign the confession that is attached to that letter. And next week, he will read it aloud to the entire family. To your sister, to your cousins, to everyone. They all deserve to know the kind of man you are." It was brutal. It was a systematic dismantling of my father's pride, his reputation, everything he held dear. It wasn't just about getting the money back. It was about forcing him to own the truth, to speak it in his own voice, to strip himself of the lies he had worn like a second skin. My mother looked at her husband, her eyes pleading. "Michael, tell me it isn't true," she whispered. "Tell me there's a mistake." My father just stared at the letter, his face a mask of utter defeat. His silence was her answer. The last flicker of hope in her eyes died, and she finally seemed to see him for what he was. With the business concluded, my grandfather's attention pivoted entirely to me. The hardness left his face, replaced by a gentle concern. "Lily," he said, his voice soft. "You're not staying in that basement another night. Go upstairs to your old room and pack a bag. You're moving in with me until we find you a new place, a proper place." The offer was so simple, so direct. It cut through all the chaos and pain of the last 24 hours. It was a lifeline. It was safety. It was care. Offered freely and without condition. Tears I didn't know I had been holding back finally welled in my eyes. I nodded once, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. "Thank you," I whispered. I looked at my father. This small, broken man sitting at the head of a table he no longer commanded. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel small in his presence. I didn't feel inadequate or invisible. I felt nothing for him at all. Not anger, not pity. Just a vast, empty distance. The power he had held over me for so long had been built on a foundation of lies. And now that the lies were gone, his power was gone with them. For the first time, I felt seen. The following Sunday felt like a dream. We returned to the Gilded Spoon, the scene of the original crime. My grandfather had insisted on it. "The truth needs to happen in the same place as the lie," he'd said. But this time, everything was different. When we arrived, my grandfather didn't let the host lead us to our usual table. Instead, he led me to the head of the table, pulling out the chair for me. He took the seat directly to my right. We were the new heads of the family, a silent, powerful statement. We sat there as the rest of the family trickled in. My aunt, my uncle, my cousins. They all sensed the tension, greeting us with nervous smiles and confused questions that my grandfather answered with a simple, "We're waiting for everyone to arrive." My mother and Maya came in together. Mom looked like she had aged 10 years in a week. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she avoided looking at anyone. Maya just looked bewildered, glancing between me and my grandfather as if trying to solve a puzzle. She sat as far away from us as possible. Finally, my father walked in. He stopped dead in the entryway when he saw me and my grandfather at the head of the table. The color drained from his face. He knew what this was. There was no escape. He walked to his seat like a man walking to the gallows and sat down without a word. Once everyone was settled, my grandfather stood up. He didn't tap his glass or call for attention. He didn't need to. His posture, his gravity, commanded the room. The nearby tables quieted, sensing the importance of the moment. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice clear and steady. It carried through the restaurant. "I have something to say. 4 years ago, I gave my son Michael a substantial amount of money. It was a gift for his daughter, Lily, to buy her an apartment so she could start her life after college." A murmur went through the family. My aunt looked at me with wide, shocked eyes. "My son," my grandfather continued, his gaze fixed on my father, "did not give Lily the money. He took it for himself. He lied to me. telling me she was living in a beautiful condo. He lied to Lily, telling her she was on her own, and he let her suffer, working 2 jobs and living in a basement while he pretended to be a noble, supportive father. A collective gasp went through the table. Maya stared at me, her mouth hanging open in disbelief. For the first time, she was seeing that my life hadn't been a drama. It had been a struggle she couldn't have imagined. My grandfather reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was the confession. He walked around the table and placed it in front of my father. "Read it," he commanded. My father picked up the paper, his hands shaking so violently I thought he would drop it. The entire restaurant was silent now, watching. He cleared his throat and began to read. His voice was a hoarse, shaking whisper. Michael Carter," he began, "admit that on June 12th, 2021, I misappropriated $70,000 given to me in trust by my father, Henry Carter. This money was intended for my daughter, Lily Carter, for the purchase of a home." He had to stop, taking a shaky breath. "I intentionally deceived my father, telling him the money had been used as intended. I intentionally deceived my daughter Lily by withholding this gift and telling her she had no financial support from her family. I allowed her to struggle financially for 4 years while I used her money for my own personal investments and gain." He read the entire thing, every self-incriminating word. He confessed to the lies, the theft, the emotional manipulation. He spoke of his greed and his pride. By the time he finished, his face was wet with tears of shame. He dropped the paper on the table as if it had burned his hands. When he finished, there was a profound, ringing silence. It was not an awkward silence. It was a silence of consequence, of a truth so absolute it left no room for argument or excuse. It was the sound of a family finally seeing itself clearly, without the comfortable lies and polite fictions that had held it together for so long. The masks were off, and in the wreckage, for the first time, I felt like I could breathe. The weeks that followed were a blur of quiet change. True to his word, my grandfather helped me find a new place. It was a sunny 1-bedroom apartment on the top floor of a building downtown, with real windows that overlooked a small park. After 4 years of living underground, the sunlight felt like a miracle. The first morning I woke up there, I lay in bed and just watched the light stream through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. There was no smell of mold, no sound of a groaning boiler, no shame. It was just a quiet, peaceful room that was all mine. It was a home. That morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened my old laptop, found the file labeled Portfolio, and blew off the digital dust. I spent the next week updating it, polishing my old designs, feeling a spark of the passion I thought had died in the exhaustion of my double shifts. I was no longer just a survivor. I was a designer again. I started applying to every interior design studio in the city. I sent out dozens of emails. my heart filled with a nervous hope I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. 3 months after that terrible Sunday brunch, I landed a job. It was a junior designer position at a small boutique firm that specialized in designing small apartments, the very kind of space I once dreamed of having. My past, which had once been a source of shame, was now my strength. I knew what it felt like to live in a poorly designed, soul-crushing space, and I knew how to turn it into a sanctuary. A few weeks later, I hosted my first brunch. Just me and my grandfather at a small table I had thrifted and repainted, set up by the window in my new apartment. The sunlight flooded the room. He looked around, a slow, deep smile spreading across his face. He raised his coffee cup in a toast. "This," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is what I imagined." I reached across the table and touched his hand, my own smile feeling more real and earned than any I'd had before. "Me too, Grandpa," I said. "Me too." We sat there in the quiet, sunny room. Two survivors who had rebuilt something beautiful from the rubble. My story has a happy ending, but the scars are still there. My relationship with my parents is broken, perhaps irreparably. My father is paying back the money, but he can never pay back the time. My mother and sister call sometimes, their voices filled with a hesitant, guilty kindness that I don't yet know how to accept. Healing is not a straight line, but my experience taught me something powerful. It taught me that secrets and lies can rot a family from the inside out. But the truth, no matter how painful, is like sunlight. It's a disinfectant. It's the only thing that allows for new growth. If you've ever been betrayed by your own family, if you've ever been made to feel small or invisible by the people who are supposed to love you the most, remember this: your truth has power. Speaking it is the first step toward reclaiming your life. Truth can rebuild what lies destroy. Like, comment, and subscribe, because sometimes the best revenge is finally coming.